Tonight we're doing the summer lectures of 2019, which is about the pogroms, the Russian pogroms of 1881, harbinger of disaster or blessing in disguise. I think I remember correctly. And I think you see what I mean by now, right, don't you? Right? Or at least part of it. And tonight is the last one, the lessons of 1881, which in reality I put these titles in long before I started the series. So it's going to be spillover from last time. It doesn't matter. If it matters, tough luck, you know. What are you going to do about it? And so I had hoped to talk more about this last time, but this is how it unfolds. Without any further ado, as I started to speak about last time, one of the most prominent and important features in Jewish history, now that we have a perspective of 150 years of the Russian pogroms of 1881. Remember, there are other Russian pogroms later. I'm talking about the ones of 1881. Was as a spark plug, as I call it, to start thinking in a practical way about doing something physical, about creating a Jewish presence in Palestine. That, in retrospect, is clearly the most significant, or arguably the most significant result. Because, as I said the other day about real estate and all the rest, it's all a mentality. The Jews could have started moving to Eretz Yisrael 30 years, 40 years earlier, at least. As soon as you had the railroad and the steamship. As soon as you had the modern technology that revolutionized everything. The great technology and science of the 19th century is the railroad, the telegraph, and the steamship. You know, that's equivalent to our computers today. Just changed everything. After all, as I always like to point out, what's the difference between travel in 1800 BCE and travel in 1800 AD? Nothing. It was a horse and wagon then. It's a horse and wagon now. Now, what's the difference between travel in 1800 and 1900? Everything. So, as soon as travel became easy, relatively speaking, and you could actually physically take a train from Russia or someplace like that, you know, down to the Mediterranean and get a ship. It's not that far. And a steamship, too. And also, when they finally got rid of the Islamic piracy, the corsairs, because, believe it or not, until the early 1800s, it was very unsafe to travel the Mediterranean. Perhaps you know a little bit of American history and the first war we fought once we finished with the American Revolution with the Barbary Pirates, as we learned, which is the Muslim terrorist states of North Africa. You couldn't go on the high seas. And that's when they formed something called the United States Marine Corps. Right? And that's when the Marines had to learn how to avoid that slashing shtick with the curved swords. And so they tied leather straps around their throat, which you get the leathernecks, you know. So you learn a lot in Hollywood squares, you know. Anyway, the bottom line is once travel became safe and relatively easy, how come a bunch of Jews didn't form a Chovei Tzion or a Zionist movement, or at least start moving in substantial numbers to Eretz Yisrael if it's that big of a deal? And there were enough out there from the millions and millions of Europe to feel that way. The answer is, it's not done. You know, it's not done. And so, Shragi Nibber once told me a story. A guy's walking in Manhattan. No, a cab driver is driving in Manhattan, and a guy pulls him over. And he says, "Take me to Chicago." "What are you, nuts?" Pulls out $20,000. He says, "Okay, okay." He drives to Chicago. Okay. You know, drives there, collects the fee, drives back. He's back in Manhattan. The guy pulls over. He said, "Where do you want to go?" "I want to go Bar Park." "I don't do Brooklyn." You understand? It's a mentality. It's a mentality. You get it? It's a mentality. And so you don't go to Eretz Yisrael. You theoretically go to Eretz Yisrael. You don't go to Eretz Yisrael. And then in the 1880s, all of a sudden people start to want to go. And relatively substantial groups start going. I'm nowhere near what went elsewhere, but that's when the quote-unquote the modern Israel begins. I think everybody kind of knows that. So how come? Obviously, if the pogroms shook everybody up, and as I say, spark plugged them, then that's pretty big. Imagine if, here's a game of what if. What if Jews would have started to go seriously to Palestine 1840s? Look here. The bottom line is the bottom line is it wasn't thought of, and now it's started to be thought of. In spite of the fact, as I tried to point out last time, that there already were at least rabbis, which are Jewish intellectuals, writing books in Hebrew in the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, Rabbi Bibas, Alkalai, Tzvi Hirsch Kalisher, and people like that, in which they're saying, let's go to Israel, let's do something, right? But it got no traction. Only in the 1880s it started to get traction. So a spark plug is a big deal. The specific form, the movement to start doing something serious about resettling Eretz Yisrael, the specific form of that movement is what we call Zionism, which is what I want to talk about tonight. Because as I said before, I think it's arguably the most important, long-term significant result of the pogroms. Now, I'm using the term Zionism anachronistically, because the actual word Zionism was coined in 1890 by a interesting fellow, Nathan Birnbaum. Let's go to who had a career, like Chad Gadya. First, he was a Zionist, a secular Zionist student in Vienna, big writer. Then he dropped Zionism and went for Yiddishism because he saw Zionism was bad. And then he converted to modern Orthodox, and then eventually became a Ger Chassid. And I'm not finished. And he ended up in the Torah Karta. So he did 180 degrees, right? And he died in Netherlands in 1937. He did 180 degrees because he's always looking, obviously, as a seeker. You get it? So somewhere along the line, in one of his mutations, he actually coined the word Zionism, Zionismus. But not in the 1880s. But you know what I mean when I say it. Now here we go. Zionism, in the way that I'm using the term, starts in the 1880s. In order to understand this, which I think is very, very interesting, and here we are in 9 days, just for Tisha B'Av, commemorating the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we're also commemorating the Meraglim. Right? The first Tisha B'Av was when the Jewish people said they don't want to go to Israel. Don't forget that. So, it starts in the 1880s. In order to understand this, I would say that you should do it in the following way. Think of two prominent aspects of Judaism. I would even say they're definitional ikrim of Judaism. Right? Where did I put my pointer? Here we go. Fundamentalism, okay. So knows you believe in God, you believe in the Torah. That's the old Jewish basic. And the other is nationhood. Okay? Which is part of the core definition of what being Jewish is. That's part of our religion. It's not just a religion about God, although that's an ikr. But it's also about a Klal Yisrael. That's not just an interesting aspect of Judaism. It's a definitional. Get it? Somebody says, I have no connection to Klal Yisrael, but I just believe in God. That's a tarta de sasri, as we call it. Again, it doesn't mean anything. Now, which of the two, let's go to the next one. Which of the two is more important? Is it possible to believe in one without the other? Can you be a fundamentalist and not believe in Klal Yisrael? Or can you believe in nationhood and not believe in fundamentalism and the God and the Torah and all that stuff? The one possible without the other. Now, once upon a time, the two were obviously intertwined. But in the modern era, it's going to be interesting because usually when somebody dropped one, they drop the other. I'll just give you a classic example. Somebody converted to another religion, so they're not a number one, therefore they're not a number two. It makes sense. But can someone get out of one and still be part of the other? It's a matter of your belief and all the rest of it. Like I'm doing now, it's very unclear. The 19th century is funny in this way. It's the first time that this kind of question or issue even arose in the way I'm talking about. Now, obviously, there are two schools of thought. One will say yes, one will say no. And that is a gigantic divide to the Jewish people down till today. Maybe you realize it, maybe you don't realize it, but it's a gigantic divide down till today. It's the big divide. As I'll try to explain as I go on. Now, obviously, some will say like this. If you don't believe in the Torah, all the rest of it, then there is no Jewish nation. I don't care. I know somebody recently decided they don't want to be religious. They want to be atheists now. I know somebody like that. And they're moving away, and somebody said, how you move away? What about your kids? It doesn't matter anymore. It's just being consistent. If there is no God, and there is no Torah, who cares who your kids marry? You see, like that. What's the difference? You say the Jewish people this way. So what? That's illogical. That's logical. And yet, there's another school of thought that what I just said is shocking, goes against the Kishkas. Maybe the person from, maybe not from, maybe they observe them, but I mean, they want to say Jew like that. And they don't do the consistency thing that I just said before. That's a giant divide among the Jewish people today, although I'm not sure everybody thinks of it in those terms. Now, for example, in Western European Reform Judaism that rose in Germany, place like that, and even in its various forms where it wasn't exactly religious reform, but very modernized in England, France, and all that, in its various iterations, Western Judaism in the 19th century denied or downplayed Jewish nationalism. This is a basic feature. Now, if you're literally the Reform movement when it started, I think everybody here is aware that they got rid of Zion, Sion, and all that stuff, because they said, it makes sense, you really say you want to go back to Israel? Go. Why are you staying in Germany? Why are you staying in Hamburg? Why are you staying in Paris? Why be a liar? If you don't believe it, then cut it out. And that goes back to the very first Reform Siddur. But it's not only Reform. I don't want to poke on that. If you ask Orthodox Jews, Western Orthodox Jews, in Paris, in London, in some other places as well, do you expect to get Israel? All the rest of it? No. Judaism is a religion. Okay? Now, if somebody's really from and learned in the Bible, the Talmud, all that, they have a different attitude. But there used to be plenty of, Jews who lived in these countries, and they were observant, believe it or not, but they didn't know much, and they really got caught up in Englishism, Frenchism, and all the other isms. It's kind of interesting. Okay? So that's why I say Western European Reform Judaism in its various iterations denied or downplayed Jewish nationalism. To be more accurate, they feared nationhood might be conflated with nationalism. And that would mean, if you're in Germany, for example, hey, if you're members of a Jewish nation, then you're not members of the German nation. So please give me back the emancipation. Back to the ghetto. And the German Jews said, well, no, we don't want that. Judaism is just a religion. In point of nationality, I'm 100% German, or French, or American, or Polish, or whatever you want. 100%. And just as with a Frenchman or an Englishman, religion is just a private matter. It's what you do on Sunday. So with me, Judaism is something I do on Saturday. Maybe a little bit more. Maybe I have a couple of food laws and things like that. That's it. But in every other area, I'm American, I go to baseball, I do all the rest of it. That's a similar time. This is very common in the 19th century. Okay? Very common. And that's why, if you look at the language of Jewish intellectuals and leaders in the West, particularly in the 19th and early 20th century, the favorite word is my co-religionists. You know, some of my brothers, my fellow Jews, members of the same nation, Am Yisrael, Klal Yisrael, even the people who actually felt that way, but you never said it. Okay? Even the people that devoted themselves honestly and well to join the Joint Distribution Committee or the Alliance, or would go and help other Jews. But that's just a tzedakah on the side. But really, my basic identity is right here, member of the nation. And that's how you get somebody like an Edwin Montague. I spoke about him last year. Remember, he's the guy who screwed up the Balfour Declaration. He was the member of the British cabinet, Jew. And if you want to be technical about this, Orthodox, because there was no reform in England. And his father, Lord Swaythling, Samuel Montague, actually started the Federation of Synagogues, which is to the right of the United Synagogue. And technically speaking, but only in a technical sense, he was an Orthodox Jew. And he's writing in the British cabinet in 1917 when they're considering and doing the Balfour Declaration, and all these Goyim are saying, let's just write it and say we hereby give Palestine to the Jews, to hell with it and call it a day. And Edwin Montague's writing these long things. Judaism is not a nationality. It'll hurt the standing of Jews in England and other countries. Judaism is strictly religion. Palestine is not really an integral part of what we are. That's only messianic stuff for who knows when. It's completely not realistic. England should not get involved in this. You're going to be doing the Jews a disservice. And in fact, he even wrote the memorandum attacking the Balfour Declaration with the title, How I Can Prove That the British Cabinet is Anti-Semitic, which is standing it on its head. But what's my point? he bought into what I just told you so much. He considered himself 20,000% an Englishman and only 10% a Jew. The 10% was involved with religious obligations. You see what I'm saying? And consequently, you can make... How can a Jew talk like that? The answer is, if you understand what happens in the modern era, particularly in many parts of Europe, in terms of changing nationalisms and changing identities and all the rest of it, you can hear that this would happen. Now, in the mid-19th century, a strain of the Haskalah in Eastern Europe developed, which is very interesting, because usually the Haskalah regarded itself as the heirs of Moses Mendelssohn. Therefore, they want to modernize Judaism in one form or another. I spoke about this at length here in this show long ago. This particular strain was repulsed by Western European Judaism, not because of their rejection of fundamentalism, but because of their rejection of Jewish nationalism. Okay, this is the famous Smolenskin, Peretz Smolenskin, who was one of the leading Musculic writers, newspaper and books and all that, a big name. And he came out with a whole bunch of articles in the 1860s and 70s. Who's the worst Jew to ever live? Moses Mendelssohn. You became so frum that you're attacking Moses Mendelssohn. You don't believe in the Torah either, or something like that, right? Moses Mendelssohn, in his mind, I don't think this is true, by the way, I'm telling what he said. Moses Mendelssohn represented the idea of what I just told you, that I'm only Jewish in religion, and even that's a weak business, and my real identity is with Germany or whatever particular country you're in, and he kind of emasculated psychologically the Jewish intellectuals and left them with an untenable kind of culture, because something that's so weak and has no real connection to other Jews elsewhere, it doesn't have a strong, vivid, and vibrant nationalistic feeling, group feeling, is doomed that the children and the grandchildren will all marry out and leave and something like that, which is what happened to Moses Mendelssohn. And I can't tell you how, this is one, not that you need to notice, this is one of those big spats that rocked the Musculic world in the middle of the 1800s. Now, he wasn't a fundamentalist, but it means that they were fierce believers in Jewish nationhood. Now, clearly, this is a combination of factors. Here's a guy from Eastern Europe. All these Musculim started from, so they had some of that in their kishkas, together with their mother's children, you picked up Klal Yisrael. But it's also true that you're simply doing what the rest of Europe is doing. Europe is going through a nationalist orgy in the 19th century. The nations are going crazy over nationalism and indulging themselves and glorifying themselves and building an entire mythology, each one, the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians. That's how World War I started. The Italians. All this was constructed. You understand? Nationalism is the idea, it's kind of a mystical idea, that a particular group is together more than the sum of its parts. You don't simply say there are 60 million Englishmen and they're just 60 million biological factoids, which is true from a technical point of view, but together they constitute England. And England is, the spirit of England, the spirit of the United States, right? America stands for justice. Well, America? What, you went around to everybody? America. But we talk like that. So that's the idea of national. Well, I shouldn't make fun of this. The Jewish notion of Klal Yisrael goes back thousands of years before European nationalism, and it's the same thing, that the totality of all the Jewish people represents far, far more than the sum of its parts. Jewish people is more than a couple million Jews. As a group, qua group, it's a mystical reality of the highest importance. And I really cannot overemphasize that. If you know anything at all about Kabbalah and things like that, that's a basic feature. Most people today, I find, don't really understand that, which is kind of funny, but it is one of the core elements of Judaism. So here's these Musculim who no longer believe but are fiercely into the group. They were not unaware that in 1880, the masses of the nations are still fundamentalist. The Hamonam out there in Russia and Poland, places like that. And interested in their Jewish national feelings in fundamentalist terms. If you go to Hasidim or others, talk about the Jewish nation. Yeah, I understand the Jewish nation. Klal Yisrael. What about the Jewish nation like the French nation? That's Goyish. You see? So they understood there's a gap between the Musculim, they're thinking in modern nationalistic terms, and the masses are thinking in the old-fashioned nationalistic terms. But that's how it was. Now, in the aftermath of the pogroms of 1881, these particular Musculim of the type I just mentioned were inspired by that pamphlet that I talked about last time by Leon Pinsker, Auto-Emancipation, to want to actually do something about getting a state in Eretz Yisrael, even if the realization of such a project was long-term. It could take a century or two. But let's actually get off our duff and actually start doing something about it. Instead of just saying, we're a nation and our homeland is somewhere, and why are you out of the homeland? Well, something happened 2,000 years called Tisha B'Av. Well, where you been since then? Well, it's a long story, but meanwhile, I don't have the time to tell you about it. I'm off to, a bridge game. No. If you really are a nation, start talking in realistic terms. After all, it's not the 1500s. You don't have to walk there. It's doable. Transportation is getting easier all the time. You got the Turks and all the rest of it. So let's start thinking in realistic terms. How do we deal with those problems, right? But to simply say, nah, is unacceptable. Now, again, that happened as a result of the pogroms. I'm talking about, this is the Pinsker from Odessa, the doctor. This is his famous pamphlet, which being written in German by an educated, non-from guy was going to make a much bigger impact on the Musculim. A lot more people read this than read those pamphlets from those rabbis in Sarajevo and people like that. So in the wake of the pogroms and their aftermath, when it was clear that there was no hope for a Jewish future in Russia, because as we've seen, the Russian government just doubled down on the anti-Semitism, okay? Then all of a sudden, starting in early 1882, right after the pogroms, late 1881, spontaneously, all over the Pale Settlement, clubs, groups, and societies form in different cities, towns, and communities. And you start to see, let's go back. Where's the next one? Maybe I did. But anyway, let's go to the next one. All over these places, and many more, somebody will start a society, B'nai Tzion. Someone will start Agudat Tzion. Someone will start a society, Eretz Yisrael. Meaning they really are local. They're from the ground up. Nobody was in charge. It's a national response. It's very interesting. It reminds you a little bit of the committees of correspondence, all that stuff, in the 13 colonies before the American Revolution. Just spontaneously, people wanted to do it. And so you see all over the place this happening. These societies usually consisted of what I would call two types of Musculim, frum and not frum, because it's a big mistake to think that all the Musculim were not religious. The frum group would consist of what I would call today modern Orthodox, of course by the standards of the 1800s, and also some regular Orthodox, including some big rabbis. At the same time, there were many other regular Orthodox Rabbanim and Balabatim who refrained from joining because it's a new idea whose direction was not entirely clear. What is new? B'nai Tzion, our parents never did this. I don't see this as a religion. What? Who's in charge? You're Machal Shab. You're the head, the one who came up with it. What are you doing over here? You speak Russian, you speak Yiddish. How are you getting involved in all this? So you can understand the, shall we say, conservative stand-pat reaction to it. But you can also understand that in every community, there are people saying, no, this is an idea whose time has come, to use modern politicians. And so, ferment results within the Jewish communities after the pogroms of 1881. Now, why was there this ferment? Look, there's nothing wrong with advocating a return to Eretz Yisrael, but you're really upsetting the status quo. Because it's not true Israel was empty. There were Jews in Israel. As a matter of fact, there was a substantial increase of the Jewish population in Israel prior to everything I'm talking about in the course of the 19th century. These are the real Orthodox, the real frum ones, who just came there one by one, what we call Yishuv HaYashan. Okay? People like that. This is not what the Musculim had in mind. Right? So we don't want the East Europe transported to here. Well, then who do you want? You want Jews that are not religious? I didn't say that. What do you want? Now, to be perfectly honest, their idea was modern Orthodox. That's kind of what they had in mind. Teaneck, something like that. That's really, but nobody knew how to articulate that in the 1800s. And so, the problem is you're clashing with something that's already growing, because The Yeshiva Yashan, and by the way, that's how we refer to those who don't know what I'm talking about. The pre-Zionist, or if you will, Haredi presence in Israel, which had no connection with anything I'm talking about. It just went on their own. That's what we call the old Yeshuv. So if you find me somebody today in Israel, I'll give you an example, Meah Sharm or something like that, and we say, oh, my family's been here 10 generations. There are people like that. So they have nothing to do with Theodor Herzl. They were there long before. You get it? So in the 19th century, this is almost like a separate lecture series. The old Yeshuv was impressively growing slowly in its own way, precisely because of the railroad and the telegraph and the steamship and all that stuff that I was saying to you before. Look at the numbers over here. In 1800 you have 7,000, and in 1880 you have almost 30,000. So it quadrupled. Now, it's not large numbers, but on the other hand, when you get down to 1900 or whatever it is, you have 56,000. The great majority of them are not Zionists. There's Yeshiva Yashan. And I'll tell you what I mean. A Hasidic Yid over here, a guy from Lithuania over there, with long payas and a long beard, decides, him and her, for whatever reason, they want to move to Eretz Yisrael for religious reasons. It used to be said, the Zionists used to put out kind of anti-religious propaganda. They said, well, they're just going to Israel to die. You've heard that before, right? To have the mitzvah being buried in Eretz Yisrael. That's baloney. People moved there because they moved there. And to be perfectly honest, the type of individual who has the gumption to travel in the 1800s to go to Palestine is actually an active type of person. And these people, out of their ranks will come people start businesses and Petach Tikva and, enterprise, all the rest of it. There weren't enough of them. We're not enough of them. But they're scrappers. They still are scrappers today, aren't they? As Israel realizes. They're scrappers. And, they're tough individuals. And, survive earthquakes and move to Palestine when you have the mosquitoes and all the rest of it. Takes a tough individual. And the Yeshuv, by the numbers, was constantly growing. In other words, now comes a family from Romania, now comes a rabbi's family from Lithuania, then come, believe it or not, somebody from Germany, and next week somebody from Austria, and a year from now, but it's a drip. It's small numbers, okay? But it was happening. So why do you have to reinvent the wheel? If there's already a Jewish community in Palestine, why do you need to start a new movement there? Everybody should move to Palestine. Just join the ones that are over there. Nah. The old Yeshuv wanted to control everything, especially the money. How did they survive? You used to have what's called Chalukah and Kollels, which means that first of all, you come to Eretz Yisrael in the old days under the Turks, long ago. Not everybody's in a position to start a business and make a go of it. Just to put, bread on the table, as they say over here, you needed outside help, which is what the Christian groups did too. You understand? There were Anglicans, there was Catholics, all the rest of it. They used to raise money from the co-religionists overseas, and that's what supported the institutions that were in the Holy Land. Some of us have been to Israel. You see, this church here and that church. Well, who paid for it? Not the locals. So similarly, the Jews who moved to Israel already for hundreds of years were getting money from overseas. As soon as you talk about money, come to Geld as Andre Welt. It's who controls the money. Then you have dirty politics. That doesn't matter if you're Hasidim. It doesn't matter if you're Litvak. It doesn't matter if you're not religious. As soon as the question of money coming in and somebody's dispersing the money, we all know where that's going, okay? So the Frum that are in Eretz Yisrael said, we don't want any new people coming. They want them to come under our framework and the way we tell them, when we say, and that's not what these people in Russia have in mind. This spark plug that I'm talking about is kind of happening independently, and they say we want a parallel Yeshuv, as it were. Not under your control, we want to do things our way. And that ticked off the old guys, the powers that be, as it always is. And this was going to be a source of tension. Now, by definition, in other words, these new groups I'm speaking about from Russia didn't want to be controlled by anybody except themselves. Now comes the interesting part. Because in the immediate aftermath of the pogroms, what emerges is, perhaps we should call it a heroic attempt to create, in the late 19th century, when how do they say, the cat's already out of the door or something like that, an old-fashioned Klal Yisrael, which is kind of late in the day, because by the time I'm talking about the splits between the Jews of religion and matter, we're pretty doggone sharp, and you already started to have the reality, the painful reality we have today, in which we're not one, we're two. There are 2 Jewish communities in Baltimore, the 2 Jewish communities in New York, the 2 Jewish communities else everywhere. You understand? They can use all the language they want, but really it's the 2, and maybe more. But here was an attempt to sort of bypass that, circumvent that, and create a Klal Yisrael, which is in the old-fashioned sense, but with a modern twist. What I mean by that is, as I said before, most people, unless maybe you've heard it from me before, because I've mentioned it very often, the old way of thinking, which was for thousands of years, was that the Klal Yisrael is a supreme value, and that what God wants more than anything else is not an all-from community, but it was a mixed community, which is kind of funny to us today because that's not the way we experience it. I'll repeat what I just said. That you can see Mesilas Yesharim and the farm like that and things like that. Is what God prefers. It's a community of the wicked, the righteous, and the ones in between, provided that there's a hierarchical set of relationships. Provided that the ones who are not observant, acknowledge that that's not the ideal and that the observant is the ideal. Once you have that acknowledgement, then we can all work together very well. And that's how it really was in every Jewish community throughout history, I believe. Okay? With rare exceptions. Because you always had the pickpocket, the thief, along with the saint and the sinner. That's how it goes. That's a real community. Okay? I'm told in Baltimore there are some people in this town who have actually broken the law. You understand? It's part of life. Now, obviously, proportions can get out of hand. But I assure you, I just didn't want to bring in and bore you. If I read you from Mesilas Yesharim, he says, the perfect community, what God wants is that there should be righteous people who pray that their zechus should go and help the other end, and the other people acknowledge that. But on the other hand, let's put it this way: sometimes you need a pickpocket to get a lockpicker to get a Jew out of jail, quote unquote. I mean, let's put it this way: who got the guns for the Warsaw Ghetto? It was the Jewish gangsters. You see what I'm saying? See, there's a time you need for everything. That's an old-fashioned Jewish idea. The problem in the modern era is, with the split over ideology and fundamentalism, you won't get this group to say that this group is right. They say, we're also right. And so the Reform think they're right, the Orthodox think they're right, and they can't have any agreement on that, so it's like a permanent split. In Russia, things were a little bit different in the Pale Settlement, and what they said was, let's try to find some enterprise in which can bring everybody aboard on this system of hierarchical relationships. The Musculim then would acknowledge the theoretical and philosophical supremacy of fundamentalism and Nomianism, regardless of what they themselves personally believe or practice. And the religious ones would acknowledge the superiority of the Musculim in what we call mili de alma, in running practical affairs. Because Pinsker, you're a doctor, you could have different foreign languages, this guy knows how to talk to the government. We're just a bunch of religious people, we don't have those kind of skills. On the contrary, though, then it's a Klal Yisrael. You contribute what you have, we contribute what we have, and based on that, we can build a good enterprise. This set of feelings that arose out of these many different societies that I just described arose spontaneously after the pogroms, resulted in 1884, which was not long afterwards, in the organization of the Chovevei Tzion. And that's what that is. It's an organization that was founded at a conference, and all these little societies have become members of it, and it's supposed to go with Jews around the world, and it kind of did for about a dozen years, and it was formed. Couldn't do it in Russia because you can't have anything political in Russia. It went right over the border into Katowice, which is in Silesia in Prussia, and they had a grand meeting of the leaders of both camps uniting together around the idea of building up the Jewish presence in Eretz Yisrael. And as I say in the picture over here, right there's the fifth klal. This picture tells the whole story. Because these are the leaders of the groups that got together. I want you to look very close in the middle. That's Leon Pinsker without the yarmulke. He was a secularist, he's an atheist. On his left is Rabbi Shmuel Moliver, and on his right is Rabbi David Karliner. These are two biggest rabbis in Russia, Rabbanim in Russia. Maybe some of you don't even know Yad David, if that means anything to you, or Nebuchadnezzar. Take it from me, one of the biggest gedolim in Lithuania. And what are they all saying? They're saying, let's bury the hatchet and concentrate on building something common. Why? Look what Russia just did. They consider us all a bunch of Jews in the same basket, so let's react in the same way. Okay? Now, this is kind of unusual, because usually these two groups would be in two different rooms, and they couldn't agree on anything. And I'll say it again, Pinsker was from Odessa. By the way, Odessa was like a notorious place for unbelief and all the rest of it. He used to, my father, I heard when I was a kid, 3 miles around Vilna, you can smell the Reich HaTorah. 3 miles around Odessa, you can smell the fires of hell. That's how Jesus used to talk once upon a time. So, and wait a minute, he's from this, and these guys are there. But you see, some have yarmulke, some of them don't. Some of this is interesting. You see. Now, what's the idea? The idea is unite. The joint leadership of Pinsker, the atheist, and Rabbi Moliver, who was a great but atypical Orthodox rabbi, speaks volumes. Here's the rabbi who was on his left, who is, now, by the way, these are famous Kehillas of yesteryear. Suvalk, Radom, Bialystok. What I mean to say is like this. You didn't become a rabbi of a big community in Lithuania and White Russia by being just a speaker, you understand? You had to be a Gaon, and you had to be a big deal. And so here's somebody who's very unusual, and this is his moment in history right after the pogroms. Very interesting biography. It was grew up right near Vilna. His father was a Talmid Chacham businessman, and from the age of 3, he was already like a Mozart. Yes, the Eloi. It really was. Don't forget it. At 4, he already knew the Chumash, all that stuff. At 15, this is the old school. At 15, you get married. At 18, you get smicha from Volozhin Yeshiva, like the Harvard, you understand? And then, another couple years of learning. Meanwhile, you learned everything up 2 or 3 times. And then he went into business, which is the old model. Don't be a rabbi, support yourself. And for like 15 years, he owned a factory, a silk factory, which is not your typical career path for a famous gadol in the old country. And therefore he learned Russian, which again is kind of unique among the Rabbanim. This is until the age of 36. And then his business went bankrupt because it's the 19th century. These things happen all the time. Every business went bankrupt from the boom and bust cycle. Get it? You used to have depressions every 20 years. So then he went to Rabbanos, had no choice, and became rabbi of big cities. He was a fantastic speaker. He was a big posek, blah, blah, blah. And then a decade after he went to the rabbinate, this is a funny story. He won the Powerball lottery of Russia. He really did. I know it sounds funny. Yeah, I think it was 30,000 rubles in those days, I'm telling you. There's a whole story. By the way, somebody stole it from him in Germany when he was in a hotel. This is the old Germany. And he jumped on a ship to run to America with the ill-gotten gain. The German police caught him and gave the money back. Now, if this guy would have jumped off the ship in Russia, he would never see that money again. That's it. But, Germany was a rule-following place. The bottom line is, he wasn't a poor man. He's not the typical rabbi. He doesn't depend on the Baal Batim. He can tell him to drop dead tomorrow. And he doesn't need anything. And he was he's in a big position. And that just gave him more respect. Okay? Now, so he wasn't typical. It's very interesting. Here are 2 of the biggest rabbis in Russia in the 1800s. Rabbi Yitzchak Inspector, everybody's heard of him. Rabbi Shmuel Moliver, some have heard of, some have not. Okay? If you're a Zionist, you know about him. And it's very interesting compare and contrast. Because Yitzchak Inspector came from a dirt poor family, learned his way up to the top. Father was a rabbi in a little town, half the size of Anatevka. And he was just learning all day long, and that's how he became, that's how his reputation grew. And that's all he was into. He wasn't a businessman, wasn't this. But on the other hand, he excelled and became a world-famous posek. Literally, the whole world was writing to him shilos. That's who Yitzchak Inspector. That's why he became so famous. And once he became the rabbi of Kovna, public affairs demanded he intervene, get involved, trying to help the Jews vis-a-vis the government and the Musculim and all the rest of it, as we've seen. But the other one, Oliver, came from a much more sophisticated background, and he didn't I won't say he attained A+ in the rabbinic world in writing Shalos and Chuvas, all the rest of it, but he was pretty big up there. Okay? Now, as I got into the story, he became the rabbi in Radom, which is a Hasidic community. He was a Litvish rabbi, Hasidic community, but the Hasidim, it's a famous story. The Hasidim became such big fans of him because he was very honest and yasherous and all that. He became big fans. They wanted to make him a rebbe. They actually brought him the outfit. You see? I kid you not. They brought him the outfit, and they wouldn't say, "I'll tell you the story," and they wouldn't let him alone. And he figured there's only this is the old country. There's only one way to get him off his back. And that is, the Litvaks eat the shalosh at home. and the Hasidim meet in the shul in the old days. And so they said, come to shul, all the rest of us. He came with his wife. That was the end of it. You understand? End of the campaign. But the bottom line is that he was unusual. And in the 1870s, which is the decade before this, when the pressure to secularize was at its maximum, he was the only one in favor of term derech eretz, which means, shall I say modern or something, secular studies to be also in the day schools and yeshivas, which is really an outlier, because he said, look what's happening, all the kids are falling by the wayside. Now, very formal, so I don't want to spend a lot of time on that. Now, over the course of the 1870s, as he sees the youth falling away, this is before the pogroms, he got in his head that Eretz Yisrael is the thing to do. We can maybe rally everybody around the Jewish nationalism idea, bring the youth to get excited about the idea of rebuilding Eretz Yisrael, because I got to give them an ideal. Regular, old-fashioned Judaism doesn't work anymore. Go to shul, putting your tefillin, say Krishma. It's the 1870s. The modernity was hitting too powerfully, and they were dropping right and left. And the other rabbi didn't know what to do. They didn't do anything. And he said, let's at least, come with some ideas. He always had a very active mind, shall we say. And like the other proto-Zionist rabbis, like Kalish or all the rest of it, they start publishing, giving speeches and articles in which they recast many of the famous statements in the Gemara and the Medrash that people are familiar with in shall we say, proto-Zionistic terms. Here's my favorite. How do you translate Teshuvah? The Gemara says, Kolu kol kitzin ve'nadavar toli el b'tshuva. Now it's very appropriate for the 9 days, a few days before Tisha B'Av. All the predicted times are over. This was at 400 years, this was at 2,700 years. You read the book of Daniel, it's 2,300 days and nights, whatever they mean, and if it's 70 times 7. All those predicted times are over, and so the Mashiach isn't coming until, it all depends on Teshuvah. So usually you say, like this, Teshuvah can mean repentance. So that makes sense. That's the usual way, Rashi, everything depends on the Jewish people repenting. You can possibly translate Teshuvah as penance, right? So the Jewish people have to suffer, something like that. You can also translate Teshuvah as return. Well, return means you turn to God. No, it doesn't. It means return to Israel. You want to bring the Mashiach, go back to Israel. So that's a different way of looking at it. This is meaning that in the 1870s, 1880s right now, what I just told you is an interesting idea is going to catch fire to some degree and begin the modern movement to do just that. In addition to its intrinsic worth, what's wrong with building up Eretz Yisrael? It does offer, as he saw it, a possibility for achdus. You see? Achdus, uniting. Because, as I said before, the big problem in Jewish life was this split, which frankly they never did solve. We have this problem today. Okay? I mean, if all Jews were on the same page on anything, we'd be pretty powerful. I always say in my classes, if all the Jews were pro it right now, today, if all the Jews, but I mean everybody, was fighting for Israel, in the media and in the press and in the academia, all the Jews, all the professors, all the writers, all the rest of it, the way all the Arabs fight for their side, we could take them. The trouble, of course, as we know, is at least half the Jews, are pro-Arab. You understand? This is our problem. If every Jew was willing to enlist in the cause, boy, oh boy, we come up the floor with them. So this is the power of the Achdus, and he thought that this could happen. In 1881, when the pogroms broke out, he was the only rabbi to get on the train and go down to Brody, right over the border where all the refugees were coming. And as he goes there, and you actually see physically these new people showing up all the time without clothes, without food, without this and that and the other. So, and he encounters, as you see over here, what is it called? Baron Hirsch and Lord Swathling, Montague, and Dr. Asher, and Shaul Pinchas. All the Jewish activists, communal activists come there, and Shmuel Molliver, and he talks to the people, and he says, where are you going? This one's going to America, this one's going here, this is going there, the other one didn't want to go. So that's what really gave him the, what shall I say, the tactile feeling that the only place for refugees to go is Israel. That's where they should go. Not to Australia, not to Argentina, not to South Africa. Go there, it's Israel. But on the other hand, he wasn't stupid. In 1881, only a few people can go to Palestine, given the conditions there. I mean, he's well aware of that. So he wants as an ideal, but he's a practical, okay? But those few should go. Of all these people over here, some, the sturdy, the able, should go to Israel. And they should start now to create an infrastructure so that more can come later. Otherwise, how's it going to happen? Somebody's got to create some farms and drain the swamps and make it habitable so other Jews can come, and then they'll help, and more Jews will come and they'll help, like that. So that's what he was meaning over here. How you do that? This became the basic idea behind what the Gochova Beit Zion movement. Okay? Get a few, and you get another few, and get another few, and little build it up. The problem was how to get the first group there and set it up. Because they're going to have a tough time. One group of atheist college students from the Ukraine, from Kharkov, had gone recently, the Bilu, that many people have heard of. Beis Yaakov L'Chumenelcha, Bilu. Big failure. They moved there, but they totally failed. Because they didn't know the first thing about agriculture, and they didn't know the first thing about the Turks, and they were all unbelievers, and they alienated all the local Jews. I mean, basically, if there's a checklist of everything you do wrong, they did wrong. And therefore, most of them died from the malaria and all this other kind of business. And the ones who didn't, left. Oh, a few stayed, but any idea they had to create something all crashed. So this was a object lesson of how not to do it. That's okay, right? We have scientists here, we have engineers. An object lesson of how not, doctors, object lesson of how not to do it is also useful. Agreed? That's the first step. So he said, well, let's get it right. But on the other hand, he wasn't dumb, and he realized you need a lot of money. If you want to do it right, it's going to cost money. Where are you going to get the money from? Can't get from the Russian Jews. Well, yes, you can. You got millionaires in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Well, he went to them. They had nothing. You got the Jews in the West. Go to Berlin and Hamburg and places like that. He gave him nothing. Then he went to Paris. He went to all the rich Jews there. He got him nothing. And even he got worn down by all this. So I want you to understand, he's going on his own dime. I mean, he really was a public servant. Nobody asked him to do this, and nobody pat him on the back, and nobody gave him a penny. There were a couple of millionaires, by the way, that said, here's $50 for the next training. He says, I didn't come for the money, and I have enough money. Because I told you, he won the jackpot. He wasn't loaded, but he could pay for his own train. And he had enough dignity not to say, ich bin nicht kein Schnorrer. I'm not looking for me. I'm not collecting for my family. My family is bread to eat. But these poor refugees, they're piling up day after day from one pogrom after another, and these people who are victims of the white pogroms, in which all of a sudden you had a bar, and now the Russian government said no Jew can have a bar. Until now you had a cigarette store, and then they passed some law that no Jews can have a cigarette store, and all the rest of it. And you're 45 or 50 years old, and you're in the middle of life, and you'll never get another career again, and you got to leave the country, and you have a wife and so many children. What are they supposed to do? I don't need the money, but they need the money. Like that. So, when are you going to go? He got so many no's, they basically gave up, or were despondent. But in Paris, on his way out, he met two important French Jews. Rabbi Tzadok Khan, who was a young French rabbi. I know they dress in France, like a Catholic priest. That's part of the culturalization that I talked about. But he was basically, he was a good guy. And Tzadok Khan, and Tzadok Khan was a Jewish Jew. You understand? In other words, he's from Alsace. That's old French Jewry. He was a modern guy, but he had, like I said before, he absorbed a lot with his mother's kugel. And he says, I know you. I see who you are, and I see what you're doing is for others, not for yourself. And I see you think about the Klal Yisrael. Nobody today thinks about Klal Yisrael, and we should do something about Palestine. And nobody's doing a doggone thing. I'm going to introduce you to a friend of mine, Michel Erlanger. Who's he? He's got a very interesting job. I would like to have this job. He was employed by Rothschild to give out the tzedakah money. You see? Rothschild's so rich, probably had to give every year, I don't know, $1 million, $2 million bucks. I don't know. Let's put it this way. He's not dealing with all the schnorrers. You get it? He's not dealing with all the organizations. He's not reading all those stupid letters you get in the mail every day. That's your job, right? In order to do that, by the way, I remember, maybe you do, Meyerhoff used to pay Dr. Louis Kaplan for that. Do you remember that? I'm old enough to remember that. After Kaplan retired, from whatever he was, so he used to get this is a long time ago, get $25,000 just to, handle all the charity things. Okay, it's an interesting job. So that's who Erlanger was, and they said, "We're going to get you into Rothschild." Edmund Rothschild. Edmund Rothschild was 35 or 37 years old, and very supercilious and all the rest of it. And they couldn't convince him that this guy's not a schnorrer. But he said, "Okay, I'll see him next Thursday," which was Sukkot. So wait a minute. Where Rothschild lives is not near the hotel Flop House where he's staying. They didn't put him up at the Ritz-Carlton, you know what I mean? He stayed at some little schnooky thing, because that's who he was, you know? And he walked, I think, 5 miles to get to the appointment in the morning in the palace. And by the way, that means he had to get up double early to daven Shachris and most of all the rest of it. And it's a very famous scene, very often written about. And he gets in to see Rothschild, who says, "Sit down, Rabbi, what can I do for you?" You know, and he expects to say, "Well, I have a very good organization, and I have a school here, and we need money and all the rest of it." And there's a very famous story. He said, "I'm a rabbi from the old school. I don't know how to speak French. I only know how to speak Yiddish, and I only know how to speak in the old-fashioned way. The old-fashioned way is you ask a question from the Parsha. And the question of Parsha goes like this. At the burning bush, Moshe says, "I'm tongue-tied. I need Ralph Svasayim. Why you want me, O Lord? I can't speak well." And God said, "I want you anyway." So it's a question. Why does God pick somebody who's not eloquent, who's tongue-tied, who has speech impediments, or whatever it means, okay? And the answer is, he said, it's a famous answer from the Maharal. He says that if Moshe would be a good talker, then people would say it was a demagogue. The way he got the Jews out of Egypt, he sweet-talked them. The way he got them to accept the Ten Commandments was he sweet-talked them. Because with the right gift of the gab, you can persuade anybody to do anything. But if he was a type of guy, and in spite of that, he was able to get them out and get them across the desert, then you see it wasn't his eloquence, but the message itself must have been, you see, the power of God's word. You understand? It wasn't what he did. So I can say to you the same way. Baron Rothschild says, "I'm not a good talker, and I have the eloquence of it, but the idea I'm presenting to you, you're not stupid." You understand? We're talking, it's not for me, it's for these refugees over here. And what are the Jewish people supposed to do about Eretz Yisrael? Now's the time to make a move. The logic of my case should imprint itself upon your sensibility, and now I'm done. And it's a very famous thing, Rothschild, who was a weirdo, because these zillionaires are all weirdos, and he's born that way, you know. So, wait a second. He said like this: if you want me to write you a check, today's Yom Tov, if you want me to write you a check in 2 days, then I'll write you a check. You just tell me how much. Well, listen, Rothschild, too much, and that's the end of it. If you really want me to get involved, then I have to think about this in my way. And he said, I picked number 2. I didn't come here for a check. I want you to get involved. And I can promise you, he said, that, it won't, what shall I say? You won't regret it, like that. And anyway, I'm only talking about a certain number of refugees now. It'll be a temporary thing. It'll be a limited thing. And you will have done a good service for the Jewish people. Well, you and I know that was a big lie. Meaning, I don't know if he knew it at the time. I don't think he was a liar. But that was not the one check that Rothschild wrote. Because another group came, and this one messed up on this, and that one messed up over there. And little by little, Edmund de Rothschild got sucked into Eretz Yisrael spending, shall we say. And every time Shmuel Mulliver said, this group it needs a little money, but this is the last time I'm approaching you. A year later, he had to write to me. He said, listen, they ran out of money. They planted the wrong thing. This happened, that happened. And Rothschild exploded. And he wrote to him all these bitter letters. And he says, you're a phony like all the rest of them. You promised me to be a clean-cut deal, and now it's a rat hole, and I keep pouring money down, and where's it going? And I bet you're stealing half of it, all the rest of it. He wrote him very bitter letters. The reason I say that is because some people here went on my first trip to Israel, the Shul trip, a number of years ago. Do you remember we went to Maskeret Batya? Is anybody able to remember that? Okay, yeah, a few. And Maskeret Batya is one of the first Rothschild settlements. Okay, Batya was his mother Betty. So there's a community Rothschild paid for. And so you go into now it's an upscale situation. And Shlomo Oliver is buried there. They took his body in the 1990s after communism fell, and they buried him in this cemetery you see over here in Musculim, which is an exact model of what they had in the old country before it was destroyed by the communists or whoever. He was a famous rabbi in his day. And I remember we had this girl, like this Bnei Akiva type girl, who was the Sheira Lumi was leading this tours around, and she was a real enthusiast. So I still remember it. And she was talking about Rabbi Mohiliver and so forth. And so she told me he's buried. This is what he wrote in his last will and testament, with all the letters from Rothschild under his head. He said, "That's my ticket in heaven." Right? I don't know if I was the biggest tzaddik that ever lived, but I put up with a lot of junk. Okay? And because if you're an honest person, it matters to you. People accuse you of stealing and all the rest. If you're a crook, whatever, sticks and stones make my bones. But if you're not, nobody likes to hear that kind of stuff. But he was willing to put up with it. And what's equally interesting, you could make a movie of this relationship. Because Rothschild himself, who they say was an extreme weirdo, got obsessed with Israel. And he spent the rest of his life buying more and more and sending more and more money, each time saying, "This is an outrage, it's a crook, I'm being Jewed down." He said every word in the book and all the rest of it, and this is the last time I'm doing it, and he never did. He never stopped. And if you know, so he poured zillions down, including some of his crazy projects. You understand? Because he's a Frenchman, so he thought, I'll just tell you a story very briefly. He thought the way to establish a sound Jewish economy, look, he's French, wine. Get it? Wine. No, it's not what you think. When I say wine, I mean like French quality wine. And where's Kenny Friedman? He's not here. And the real stuff. But in order to do that, you have to do the right grapes. So Rothschild money is not an object. He got the best vintners in France and Italy, which were the world's chief, to code Palestine and show them what to do. I remember somebody wrote a book about it, and they poured a ton of money in, and the climate wasn't right. So at that point, the businessman will walk away. Not Rothschild. He put in air conditioning, in 1890s, air cooling. And then it was something with the boll weevil. And then it was something with this. And he was obsessed. He kept pouring more and more money to get the right grape. And after everything was totally climate controlled and all this artificial thing, they did produce a grape which did get bottled into a fancy wine, which won the prize in southern France. I forget what it's called, the Nobel Prize of Wine, in 1906. And everybody was like shocked. And Rothschild said, "See, you all thought I was a fool as an economic. I knew what I was doing. I spent a lot of money, but now we have that wine, and we have an automatic market, the Palo settlement. All the Jews over there will buy Israeli wine, top quality, and we'll have 5-10 million Jews buying this, and I will make a profit, and ha on you." Well, guess what? Palo settlement, all they know is Manischewitz and Shapiro's, Cream Malaga, that's where our ancestors drank. So it didn't go anywhere. It didn't matter. So they had to eventually settle for what we call today Rishon LeZion wines. But it just shows you how much he got into it and all the rest. At one point, believe it or not, he bought the Kotel. I kid you not. But then he was advised you better undo that because the Muslims would go crazy and kill everybody in Palestine. It's a long story. And at the end of his life, he died in 1934, so he was 90 or something like that, almost. He was 91. It's a famous thing. Even then, he wrote his last letter the day before he died was, "This is my last check." And it was. But he had 1,000 letters like that beforehand. You understand? All the way through in 1890, 1895, and someone, "This is my last check. And I'm through with you guys," and all the rest of it. But he never did get over it. Right? So, this Shmuel Oliver somehow or other touched the right button on him, even though he cussed him out. It is interesting, And frankly, without his money, they never would be in Israel, because the Chovei Tzion meant well, but they couldn't raise any serious money. Let's put it this way. The Society of Schleppers in Warsaw, and the Society of Schleppers in Odessa, and the Society, between all of them, they get 10 kopecks. How much do you get from Russia? Even there's a lot of people, but what does everybody have to give? And we're all talking about one check and knock it out of the park. So all those communities that were the founding communities of the modern Yishuv Rishon LeZion, Maskeret Batya, Gedera, Yesod Amala, all those places was through land that he purchased and then gave money to build stuff on there, even though he's always quarreling with them. And it's a complicated story, but that's what happened. And this is the person, therefore, Shmuel Moller, who started the Chavei Tzion, as you can see over here. Each one bringing in his Chavra. You, Pinsker, will bring in the non-From, and I, Shmuel Moller, will bring in the From, in a grand enterprise, so that hopefully the Achdus that we represent will be the proper response to the Tsar of Russia. That's how it went. Okay? And as I said before, the basic hierarchical relationship was like this. The religious will be in charge of sending people primarily and taking care of the ruchniistic side, the spiritual side, and the non-from will be in charge of administering the money and building the colonies and all that, but they will respect the Torah mitzvahs, especially the mitzvahs of Tliyus Baris. There are a lot of laws connected with agriculture and Eretz Yisrael. The Trumas, the Meiser, this, that, and the other, which from a modern perspective is ridiculous, but they said, no, if that's the Torah law, okay. You understand? Now the problem is that they didn't. They lied. This is a big tragedy. Because the Chavei Tzion was a big project that might have served as a genuine bridge. It's a shame. As a genuine bridge between the religious and the not religious in the way that I just described, but instead it turned into something very bitter. They couldn't in the long run. And the reason is because their plan was not to set up a religious state in Israel. That's not what they wanted. That's not what their belief was. They wanted to set up a secular state. And therefore, they couldn't do things, despite whatever they promised, that would facilitate, a kind of transportation of the Pale settlement modified for Palestinian conditions. That's not who they were. And so that's the shame. But in the short run, in the aftermath of pogroms in the 1880s, the movement was very popular, and some of the biggest rabbis, as I said before, were card-carrying members, as they see. Let's go to the next one. Yeah, Yitzchak Spector, and Netziv, Hildesheim, for example, David Karliner. These are big names, and they said, we know that the organization is run by religious, not religious. We know the head is Dr. Pinsker. We know he eats a ham sandwich, all the rest of it. But we're all. No, he did. He said, but for Israel, we can bury our differences. And provided we all keep our promises, we can cooperate over here, which is actually very, very interesting. In fact, the Netziv over there, who was the Rosh Hashiva of Eloshen, you can imagine how religious he was, he waxes lyrical over the Achdus themes. Those who know about the writings of Netziv, who is an extremely Orthodox rabbi, knows that he always gives great primacy to Jews uniting, even of different stripes. And there's a famous tshuva in his response to the literature where he was asked by Belzer Hasidim from Galicia, should you form separate communities, have one nothing to do with the other? He says like a cherev in the goof of Israel. It's like to have two separate communities is like a sword in the body of Israel. Even though today we do, but he's coming out of the old school, as I say before. And so, as I said, for a short while, it was a unique movement trying to bridge the gap between opposite ends of the spectrum. I would say that really they were influenced by the terror of the pogroms. You seem to do this. They didn't accomplish much because they didn't have the money. And then stuff started happening, as I say, in the late 1880s. The big controversy was over Shemitah, okay? Because what do you do in the 7th year when you're not supposed to work the land? And this is my friend Sammy Finkel, wrote a book all about Masker Batya and the Shemitah crisis of the 1880s, I think it was, in which you have a Rothschild settlement that he's paying for all the things, for all their expenses. And these were from guys who were farmers that they transported from Russia to be farmers in Israel. Okay, these are not learners, that kind of stuff. They're from guys, but they are farmers. They want to be the classic chalutzim. I mean, this is the real thing. And they worked hard and all the rest of it. And the question was, what do you do in the Shemitah year? And it's known that Shmuel Oliver and Rizal Spector also said they can make the heter mechira. That's where it comes from. They can sell the land to a guy, and then it's technically okay. There were some other people like Rodor Karliner says you could do certain malachas, the Rabbanan, not the Raisa, that kind of business. But most of the rabbis and worlds like this, you can't fool around with Shemitah. That's like a basic. The Torah promises you good if you do it and bad if you don't. And some of the biggest Zionist rabbis, like the Netziv, who was a very big a Chavei Tzion, a person, said, if you do this, I remember I saw it, if you did this, then Israel will result in a Palestinian state. It's the first time I saw the word Medina Palestinate back in the 1880s. And I'll say it again, he was a big believer in Israel and all that kind of stuff, but at the same time, he says you should, when the Torah talks about Shemitah being a cardinal thing, like keeping Shabbos, so they have to do it. Rothschild was the rabbis who gave the Heter Mechira didn't do a favor, because Rothschild was the type of person where if you tell him this is the Jewish religion, he'll say another stupid Mishigas, but okay, it's another check. No, I mean, he was that way. By the way, he wasn't from, because his father was James Rothschild, who was a famous playboy, but his wife was. She was the daughter of the Rothschild from Frankfurt, the only religious one who was Baron Karl Wilhelm von Rothschild, very famous banker and he was the president of the synagogue of Samson Revelers. Just to give you an idea what I'm talking about. So the wife was very religious. Now, if you're rich, you can work at anything. He didn't keep kosher and she kept kosher. It's not a problem. What do? It's a palace. This is the kosher kitchen. This is not kosher kitchen. Okay. In fact, even at a yacht, he visited Palestine in 1913, I think, on some luxury yacht. Rothschild, what's the matter? Rothschild. 2 kitchens. This is for the trade people, this is for the kosher kitchen. Money's no object. And he was this type. I'm going to tell you a story, and this is just my own particular opinion, and it's not worth anything, but it's kind of cute. And that is, years ago, I once read a article by Jacob Katz, the famous historian, who was talking about religious controversies in the 19th century, of various ones, the second day of Yom Tov, and this thing, and the Siddur, and whatever. And one of them had to do with circumcision in the Mitzitza B'Peh, in which they have the oral suction by the Moel, which is like a total turnoff to the Western sensibility, even though they're doing it for thousands of years. And starting in the 1830s, I think it was, 20s or 30s, in the Stadt Temple, where we were in Vienna, a kid died, and they said it's because the Moel must have had gonorrhea or something like that. I don't say it's true. I'm just telling you what they said. And these fancy Jews all freaked out, and they said this can't be done. And as a result of that, they came up in the 1800s. The Chassam Sofer came in 1800 with the tube that they use now. You understand? It's more hygienic, right? There's no direct business. It's okay with me. But there are also these real religious types that say, no. Mitzitza B'Peh. Now, in France, I saw this in Jacob Katz article. In France, in the 1840s, you had what I would call French Reformed Judaism. Now, it wasn't Reformed like in Germany. It was Orthodox, but with a lot of reforms stuck in it. And, it's France. They got their Mishigas. And especially the old-fashioned French mentality. And, they put an organ in the synagogue, all kind of stuff like that. And one of them was they banned Mitzitza B'Peh for health reasons. And being that it's France, everything is top-down, like Napoleonic style. They used to have the consistory, which gives orders. So they ordered all the Moel to take an oath in court, civil court, that they will not use that ceremony when they're doing the bris. And there was one guy who did it anyway, Rothenberg, I remember his name, and he wanted to put him in jail. It was a bunch of business. And then James Rothschild, who got married late in life, I told you he was a playboy, he got married late in life, so he had a baby boy. Now his family, they're from Germany. They're going to come over here. They don't know from no tubes or anything like this. At that time, the Rothschild was still very old-fashioned yekas. And so he's like, what are we going to do? For my family, can't do it. Well, money, if you have money, nothing's an object. Because he was himself the president of the consistory, of the Consistoire General. So they're the ones that passed the law that you can't have the Mitzitza B'Peh. But for Rothschild, he brought a mole from London, so he knows he wasn't subject to that oath. And they had the bris in the Austrian embassy, so it wasn't in French soil. So they didn't violate the rule that says over there. They said, therefore did Mitzitza B'Peh. That kid was under Rothschild. That's the funny story. Right? So if I wanted to, if I was in a rabbinical mood, I could say, this is why he had a Mishigas for Israel or something like that. And that would be good at a Hasidic convention. But whatever the case is, he had really strange emotional feelings, and because Rabbi Spector, who was the number one rabbi in the world of halacha, said that they could do the Heter Mechira, and these guys would not do it, as a matter of conscience. So he banned them, and he put a boycott on them. They almost starved to death. Okay? In fact, some children died from malnutrition during that year and all that, because he was trying to show his bossiness, which goes to show you, when you rely on some very rich person, you're subject to all their mishigasim, because that's how it goes. And this book, like I said by my friend here, Finkel, is all about that episode. You understand? So it's actually kind of interesting. I usually don't go around selling books and all that, but for Sammy Finkel, I'll do it. And and if you're at all interested in what I'm talking about today, as you can see, it goes through in great detail and a lot of pictures. You'll like it. So, there used to be a rabbi in Baltimore, Rabbi Agus, in Bethel, conservative rabbi, and he was a big intellectual. A big intellectual, and he wrote like 15 books. And one was the evolution of philosophy of Jewish history, and one was the Jewish philosophy of evolution of history, one was the Jewish history of philosophy, evolution. He was a big egghead. And the people at Bethel at that time who started the shul were guys who owned, pants stores, and they were no big intellectuals. And I remember his son wrote it in the book about the father, and he had the newest book, the evolution of the philosophical whatever, and they did it at the Brotherhood breakfast. You understand? To sell books, and they put it up like in a bookstore like that. And one of the biggest guys in the shul, who, like I say, was no intellectual, he went over. He said, "Rabbi, I'm your biggest fan, and I'm going to buy 2 copies like I always do. But I hope this book has some pictures of it." That's how it goes. So the bottom line is that the Shemitah brought out a lot of the fissures in the movement, and it got really, I would say they took the steam out of the Achdus, of the unity, and it was clear that the Musculim aren't interested even in a modern Orthodox issue, but they wanted to turn Palestine into the last redoubt of the Haskalah, and that's what they did. Because the Haskalah movement is one that started in Germany, and then died out, and then went to Central Europe and died out, and then went to Russia. And Russia had also died out, because the kids either became Russified, or some other variant of that. Most of them became Russian sooner or later and dropped any interest in Ivrit. And it was a movement that could not last. It's always a 1 generation, 2 generation movement. How's it going to last? The Musculim at the end of the 19th century said Palestine. And they succeeded in that. Because the modern state of Israel, the secular culture, and there is one, of course, is the Haskalah. Just in 20th century terms. Now, I just want to point out, there was nothing to replace the Chovei Tzion, but a lot of people are very sad that you saw the Chovei Tzion ideal dissolve the way it did. And Elijah Gordon, who tells the Rav, again, a super frum person, he said, why can't we make a Haredi Zionism? Make an ultra-Orthodox group that will do the same thing. Start colonies, farms, chalutzim, and all the rest of it. Like you have, for example, in 1 or 2 places in Israel today, black hat kibbutz, or something like that. But of course, it takes money, and they money, so none of these ideas ever got off the ground. So that's the story of Israel. I do want to point out, before I move on to this is not Satmar. None of these big rabbis had trouble with Mashiach not coming, you understand? Satmar will say, you're not allowed to do anything at all to try to set up a Jewish state or anything like that in Israel. You should leave entirely for Mashiach. In fact, it's the biggest sin. If you read the writings of the Satmar Rebbe, it's the biggest sin in history to do that. Well, it's just interesting. It didn't bother the Netziv, and it didn't bother Richard Golan Spector and all these other big rabbis in Lithuania. So there's a big difference between the Hungarian rabbis on the one hand and the Polish-Lithuanian rabbis on the other. In the one case, they had a very strong objection to anything involved with this in religious principle, and the other one is pragmatic. If the Chovei Tzion would have worked out, if they would have a mashgiach for kashrus everywhere, and the schools would be, modern, but religious, even I would say, even to the left of TA, they would have been okay with it. It's just that they were beyond that. They ended up teaching and inculcating a whole generation, as we know, of Israelis, with a full secularism, and therefore basically a complete rejection of fundamentalism. So that's what happened. Now, the failure of the Chovei Tzion experiment meant that there would be no significant Zionist response to the pogroms. The ideas that I just told you, Shmuel Molov and the others, were in 1881 or 1882 we'll send the first group. In 1883, we'll send the second group. In 1884, we'll send the third group. And pretty soon you start to have 100,000 Jews, 200,000 Russian Jews in Palestine. And so by 1900, you got to have 1 million. Something along that thinking. None of that happened, did it? Instead, you had very, very tiny numbers. There weren't even 100,000 Jews by the time the First World War came around. It was like 80,000 in the whole of Eretz Yisrael. Even though theoretically they could have done it. But it didn't come to pass. The millions of immigrants, as you and I know, would go to America and other places. This is very profound in terms of its consequences, because in these other places, they would be physically safe, but they would be Jewishly decadent. Okay? They all lost the Yiddishkeit over there. These immigrants who moved to England and France and the U.S. and Argentina and Australia and eventually South Africa, all these places, as we all know, they were not really established any new, vibrant Jewish cultures to replace the Russian Polish. Instead, they would coast along for about a century or so on Yiddish nostalgia. What if I tell you Jewish, in the time you're Bubby and Zadie? They talk Yiddish. There's a little bit left over from the old country. Nobody developed anything new American, really hot here, Jewishly. We don't have no Shalom Aleichems even. In America, we didn't do anything. Instead, you have comedians. You understand? No, it's true, right? Listen, I'm not happy about it. It's sad, but it's true. Okay. So when they left the Pale Settlement and didn't go to Palestine, they went to countries where they turned out to be physically safe in the 20th century, but Jewishly it fell apart. Okay. So the West would, if you want to be perfectly honest about it, from the spiritual sense, not the physical sense, but from the spiritual sense, the cultural sense, the West turned out to be one big pogrom. See? It didn't need to be, and that's our fault, but nevertheless it happened. In Russia itself, the worst pogroms would take place 20 years after the first ones, in the first decade of the 20th century. We have the Kishinev pogroms and things like that. They were a lot worse. A lot more people that were killed than in 1881-82. Because then you had a czar who was just a doofus. You know, Alexander III was a strong guy. So when he said, we're closing this down, they closed it down, even though we replaced it with terrible laws and gzeras and the white pogroms, as I said before, the administrative pogroms were terrible. But at least it was a law and order. Nicholas II was just an idiot. You understand? And it's the worst of all possible things, which is why eventually he got killed. Okay? Everyone was exposed. If we look at the consequences, and as I'm trying to wrap this up by looking at the consequences of the 1800 pogroms, is Europe, everyone was exposed to the fact, it's hard to say, Jewish blood is hefker. I'll tell you what I mean. What happened to the people that perpetrated the pogroms in 1881? Nothing. What happened to the people that perpetrated the pogroms in Kishinev? Well, nothing. What happened to the people that killed all the Jews in Odessa in this time? Nothing. Not really. Okay? And this is a dangerous fact, which is why Jabotinsky, who was born in 1880, in Odessa, grew up saying what? He said the Jews have to have an army, every Jew has to get a gun, all that kind of thing, right? Why is he always talking about all this? Because he grew up in places in which it was too open to all the Gentiles. They can get away with doing whatever you want to the Jews, and nothing really. That's very, very dangerous. Okay? Because the crowd, the bullies, like the helpless. They like to beat up on the helpless. That's how it goes. In 1920, those pogroms will be put into a pale because 100,000 Jews will be slaughtered in the Ukraine. It's the biggest shechita since Tisha B'Av. They used to say Khmelnytsky, if you want to be very technical about it, the historians now have knocked down the numbers. We'll never know for sure. Used to say 100,000 were killed by Khmelnytsky. Now they say it's more like 50,000, even 30,000. Maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong. But there's no question what happened in 1920. That wasn't that long ago. And it's the same kind of business like in the Cossack massacres. The same people did it, Ukrainians. And there you just butchered whole communities, men, women, children, slit their throats, they burned people alive, the whole 9 yards. And that was literally 100 years ago, after the First World War. So you see what the pogroms in Russia unleashed. Okay? Now again, what happened to all those perpetrators? Nothing happened to them. Except if you want to take the very long role, Stalin eventually killed 20, 30 million people over there. But that's not a Jewish thing. The way was opened as a result of what I said to the worst pogrom of all, which of course was Hitler. Okay? All he did was take the 1801 and modernize it, industrialize it, take across the board. And once again, what happened to Hitler and all the other? Nothing. The great, great majority of the perpetrators of the Holocaust, whether you're comfortable with it or not, totally got away with it and died in their bed. Eichmann is an exception. That's exactly why Ben-Gurion did it. He said, we want to show we get some, right? But to the guys to the right and the left and all the rest of it, you know what I'm talking about. I don't have to tell you. So in other words, those are big and thoughtful and painful consequences of the pogroms of 1881. As for Israel, the failure is very consequential. The failure of the Chovei Zion experiment meant that the state of Israel would develop as a secular atheist enterprise. Because by the time you get to the 1890s, there's no question which way the yeshiva is going. Now, there's always a minority of religious, but the ones with the power are not. And after the First World War, when they controlled the Aliyah certificates, they did what they called the Gucci Aliyah, and they would make sure that only people like them get in, but for the most part. And it was created, therefore, the modern secular majority, decisive majority, which created the modern state of Israel in 1947-48. Right? This is what happened. And gave its particular character, the Ben-Gurion, Golda Meir, whatever character. Well, that's okay with me, but the problem is that ever since the 1880s, when they had when the whole thing fell apart, it means from now on, the Haredim are going to regard this as illegitimate, lacking in Jewish legitimacy. And that's pretty bad. Why do I say it's pretty bad? Today, that's the fastest growing group, both in Israel and America. Okay? Take the Hasidim, for example. It's physically the fastest growing group in Israel and America. Now, notice demographically. So you still have large numbers of people, and growing, who live in Israel, for example, as well as elsewhere, and they live in Israel, and they regard the state of Israel as something illegitimate, because ever since the Chovei Zion, the other side showed the real colors and betrayed, and this and that and the other, they're trying to set up a non-from enterprise, and to them, nationhood without fundamentalism doesn't mean anything. Because that's the basic religion, that's the Haredi position. Nationhood without fundamentalism is almost an oxymoron. Whereas to the secular, I told you, it's a very big issue today. Whereas to the secular Jews, it's the opposite. Right? Nationhood is everything, and fundamentalism is, you take it or leave it. Okay? And they'd rather leave it, frankly. But, in other words, what is the dream of Yair Lapid or something like that? What's the Ben-Gurion? Religion is a passing phase. Some place it lasts longer, some place less long. It's a mishigash. These are people in denial. They don't understand what science is. They don't teach you the basic, astronomy, physics, and everything else that shows you the religion is a bunch of baloney. But don't worry, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren will get it sooner or later. So their vision is one like that. So both sides have a zero-sum game. But if at least now in the year 2019, that side is shrinking and this side is growing. And you have a huge number of people that have contempt for the Israeli flag, and they have contempt for Yom Ha'atzmaut. I mean, you know this. I'm telling you anything you don't know. And it really goes back to what I just told you, the aftermath of the pogroms of 1881, and the failure of the Chovei Zion experiment, and the failure, therefore, to make them feel they're really part of this enterprise. And nobody foresaw it. You never see 100 years ahead. But you and I now can look 150 years backwards, and we can have 20/20 hindsight. And so, on a broader level, therefore, it's like really of heavy importance. I don't know if I imagine everybody follows the news like I do, so then you do know what I mean. On a broader level, I would say philosophical level, the pogroms were the first in a series of jolts to Jews besotted by Western culture. If you went to 1880, in Russia, let alone elsewhere, everybody really was nuts over Western culture, European culture. After all, in the 1800s, the Europeans went leaps and bounds beyond everybody else. That's why, as you know, the Europeans were able to take over the world in the 1800s. So by the time you get to the year 1900, the whole doggone Africa is owned by 4 or 5 countries. The whole Africa, right? Between the British and the French, and the Portuguese and the Belgians and 1 or 2 others, the whole thing was there. And similar with Asia, okay? almost all of Asia. I mean, the British ruled India and Burma and Pakistan and Malaya and who knows what, the French had Indochina. How'd they do that? These nations that they took over had 10 times the population. Yeah, but the Europeans had the technology, didn't they? Okay? They had the guns and the cannons and all that. So I'm simply saying that Europe looked formidable in the 1800s. And it looked like they had the breakthrough to the supreme culture that will be the highest culture that ever will be forever and ever and ever. And so it became like a golden calf. So you can understand that most Jews felt it necessary, if not to totally bow down to it, at least give it a nod. Where does the Hirschian approach of term derech eretz? What's that all about? You acknowledge the increasing value, important value of European culture, even though you keep Torah mitzvahs, and all that kind of business. Very, very few people, particularly in the Russian Empire, went against that. Okay, everybody really saw the Western culture as all powerful, and then came the pogroms, and they saw it's the same group that we've been dealing with for thousands of years. Same people who saw it as Western culture don't mind burning, pillaging, arson, rape, and all the rest of it, and the ruling authorities are complicit. Okay, certainly by the reaction. So what happened to all the great achievements of culture and claims and all the rest of it? And Hitler, of course, is another in more recent times. These are markers in Jewish culture. They led, certainly to the Orthodox, deep alienation from Western culture. In the Haredi world, I would say today, which is the fastest expanding one, is a deep alienation from Western culture. Now, the modern Orthodox disagree, and that's the split in Orthodoxy today. That's the split. But there you have it. It goes back to that. It's ironic because Western culture has certainly brought many benefits, including to Jews. And like all fundamentalist groups, Jews, the firmest Jews, are willing to benefit from the fruits of Western culture, even though they don't subscribe to the culture itself that produced those technological fruits. Okay? Same thing is true with Islamic fundamentalists as well. Osama bin Laden knows how to use a cell phone, so to speak. Right? Many people make the mistake, you see, fundamentalists think it's the Amish. The Amish have a shita, they don't use modern technology. They're the only ones. All the others have no problem using modern technology, but they reject the culture that produced the technology. You see? So, the big question, therefore, is how can you have a healthy Jewish relationship to Western culture? Can it be worked out? Not. These are existential questions that we lived with down till today. The first jolt of which was the pogroms of 1881. That is why I chose this theme for the pre-Tisha B'Av season this year. And therefore I say that I wish you an easy fast but a thoughtful one. And with that we are adjourned, sign and die.